My friends, I am happy, extremely delighted to be here with you one more time to set this Easter edition of the Shepherd's Quiver. It is interesting that you have a couple of persons who still wonder and ask questions why Easter is such a significant moment for Christians. And we can always say the significance of Easter has its roots in the life, mission, crucifixion, resurrection of Jesus Christ. However, the high point is the moment that leads from Palm Sunday through to Easter Sunday. The days that follow Palm Sunday we normally call Holy Week, and these bear testimony to what we as Christians hold superior: the Lord's Supper, the agony of Christ himself in Gethsemane, a close friend's, a close associate's betrayal, Jesus' condemnation by Pilate, his crucifixion on Golgotha, his burial. But more essentially, we come to put a lot of emphasis on the thing that revives our hopes, which is the resurrection that happens on Easter morning. Let me share with you the thoughts of a dad whose son died. And when the son was being buried, this dad's pain was raw and real. However, he summoned the courage to embrace that dark reality and see his son lowered into the bowels of the earth. That father says this was only possible after he contemplated the words of Jesus himself, which words say, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Words from John chapter 12, verse 24. The Apostle Paul paraphrases those words of Jesus in this way: "What you sow does not come to life unless it dies." This we will find in 1 Corinthians 15:36. And so this grieving father, through the eyes of faith, understood his son's death as a transit point to newness and fullness of life. And one thing I don't want to make of the trauma associated with grief is to trade classroom reputations for the hurt of others. You know, the resurrection of Jesus Christ reveals itself as an event that goes beyond the limits of historical veracity, whilst also opening up new perspectives of interpretation. In the person of Jesus, not only a miracle is reported, but there is a radical disruption of all supposed finalities that becomes obvious for every believer. Failure, guilt, loss of personhood, and even death itself begin to lose their absolute character. I make reference to Jürgen Moltmann, German theologian, systematician, also a liberationist, who says that the resurrection is the decisive sign that God's future is present now, and so makes the resurrection the ground and starting point of Christian hopefulness rather than despair. In a time such as ours, marked by ruptures, fragmentations, and recurring experiences of crisis, The resurrection of Jesus takes an interpretive depth that really remains open to transformation. In this sense, it is my imagination that the resurrection does not contradict critical thinking, but it challenges critical thought to go beyond purely observable explanatory models and to take transcendence. Or I actually met a friend who looks at transcendence from the perspective of what he calls intangible reality. And so the resurrection of Christ opens up that window for us to take the domain of intangible reality seriously. However, because Jesus Christ is not an imaginary figure only, the resurrection always has to be tied to his concrete person. So the son of Mary and Joseph, and also to the experience of that community at the time, which understood this event not as an inner psychological or emotional coping strategy, but a real encounter. So the resurrection is not only a return to life from the dead, but it is a new creation, a beginning of a reality in which life itself is viewed and defined differently. Such a view of the resurrection story is very highly relational and transformative too. So new life happens among us. New life happens between us, and new life happens in us. And it is an invitation to understand one's own life in the light of renewed possibilities and reconciled relationships. Basically, an encounter with the risen Lord is possible at any moment, even today. It could also occur anytime in the future. We just have to be ready. I believe God grants a new life of a completely different kind after death. That life cannot be threatened by illness, not by pain, not even by death itself. It cannot be destroyed by violence. So the resurrection of Jesus Christ serves as a profound theological anchor of the concept of renewed opportunities. And the resurrection frames the Easter story not merely as a historical irregularity, but as a definitive ground and starting point for Christian hope. Again, I'm attracted to the words of Jürgen Moltmann when he says the resurrection presents a new beginning that breaks into the present, demonstrating that the powers of death, oppression, and alienation are already being overcome by the presence of God's future. So to speak, Moltmann makes mention here when he talks of God's expected future being present now in how we understand, experience, and interpret the resurrection. Moltmann basically is insinuating here a kind of realized eschatology. So this is not the time when theological jargons should play on the reality of the event we are witnessing to, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So from this perspective, the setbacks and crucifixions of human experience can be reinterpreted as the very conditions through which God's transformative power breaks through, offering a recurring possibility for us to bounce back. I think this is how we have to understand the resurrection of Jesus Christ from a very, very accommodative perspective, so it doesn't become too complex for people to handle. You know, it's a bounce back. And so it's an opening for us to embrace a life which is defined by God's end time promises rather than by terminal despair. Of course, the pain of Good Friday, like the pain of the father I mentioned from the beginning of this reflection, could be very devastating for some. I mean, for many of us, actually. However, the resurrection hope, the resurrection reality that redefines how we perceive our own existential realities becomes necessary so that we will always understand that even if we get to a dead end in our daily interactions, in the things that give us a sense of belonging, a sense of being, we can always trust in the power of newness, namely that God is ready to open alternative doors for us to see through, pick up the broken pieces from what we thought was a finality, devastating and despairing, and then continue into a new perspective, into a new direction. God is always ready to bring us new beginnings. That's what we should know. And I think that's the story of Easter. That's what Easter brings to us as victory. It triumphs over disappointments, over failures, and opens new horizons for us to see things differently, define life from another perspective, but more importantly, still rooted in the reality of God as He is revealed to us in Scripture and in His Son Jesus Christ. So, dear friends, let this Easter be a new beginning for you and for us all. Take advantage of the fact that Jesus does not remain in the grave. God brings Him out and sends Him into a new dimension. You know, after the resurrection, He has to ascend. And so, my friends, wherever you listen to me from, I think the resurrection power is the capacity of God to transform what we thought might have been a setback, failure, no sense of recovery, into something new, something that gives us hope, and that's something that tells us all is not lost. That's the power of Easter. That's the power of the resurrection. And with these things said, I'll always continue to keep you in my prayers, hoping that God will give you a new sense of direction.